Well, Brian, thank you again. Really appreciate you joining us on Bits and Bants. This is episode 8. And I'm speaking to Brian Whippo from Algorand. Am I pronouncing your surname correctly?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. It's a cool surname.
Thank you.
So my first question is, how would you describe what you do to someone outside of technology? Maybe someone who's heard of blockchain, but isn't quite au fait with the more sort of everyday use cases of it.
Oh, great question. I think there's 2 layers to the answer to this question. I almost don't even attempt to explain blockchain to people outside of tech because it's very complicated. But on the DevRel layer, I say to people, developer relations is sort of like this interdisciplinary space that spans sort of a range of things from evangelizing and marketing software to software developers at one end of the spectrum. And then we go all the way to the other end of the spectrum as well to do sort of hands-on, we call it concierge engineering, to help with partner integrations and things like this. On the blockchain side, it's very difficult to explain, but I like to say to people that there's certain types of problems in the world for which you might want to use a blockchain as a public ledger or a public database for things like payments or to record data that should be public and, kind of pique people's interest a little bit and then go deeper there. But, I try not to hit people over the head with blockchain.
That's fair. I think blockchain is one of those things where you have a use case for it where it's like, oh my gosh, that is absolutely perfect. Yeah, I want this immutable record versus not. I want to talk a little bit about your background. I know that you studied financial economics and English writing. Those are 2 really interesting disciplines. Talk to me about how those come together in your current career.
I don't know if they really come together in a real dovetail way. There was a time when I wanted to be a journalist, and so I studied nonfiction English writing for a while in university. But I will say that being a creative writer helps you articulate thoughts and ideas and really like organize things in your mind, and has really paid dividends throughout my career. The financial stuff, right, I made a career change. I didn't start out in software or technology, and I worked for an investment bank for 15 years doing all sorts of like deep investment bank sorts of things with derivatives and stuff like this. But I will say that time has given me a real appreciation for like how the world of money works and how business works and all sorts of skills that you learn from working for a world-class investment bank. And I try to keep those in mind, even though I'm in sort of a new phase of my career and really focus on the technology and inspiring people to use blockchain at the moment.
I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into that.
Sure.
So you've worked for me, as you said, huge global sort of investment banking transformational programs. What nudged you towards developer relations?
So this happened to me sort of unintentionally. I had been building little apps and even a library for the Algorand blockchain in my nights and weekends. This was a hobby for me for a few years, actually. And I joined a hackathon and I got like a 3rd place prize. And I was like, oh, this is kind of fun and interesting. And this went on for a while where I was sort of like the nights and weekends DevRel in Discord answering questions for people. And when a role opened up at the Algorand Foundation last like winter 2024, a few different people reached out to me and they're like, hey, you should take a look at this role because you're sort of already doing some of these DevRel sorts of things. So I took a look at it, and I had been wanting to get more into the technology space proper. When you work at the bank, unless you're the developer who owns the system, you can't touch the code, right? You can talk about requirements of the code, you can test the code, you can discuss all of that, but you can't touch the code. So I kind of wanted to hop over the wall. And a conversation with John Woods, our former chief technology officer, sort of unlocked a series of conversations that led to a really interesting and compelling opportunity. So I sort of happened upon DevRel and this career change in an unintended way.
It's so fascinating to me every time I hear how someone came into DevRel, because I don't think it's something that you necessarily start your college career with or even your first few jobs.
Right.
Something that reveals itself like, oh, wow, there's this, as you said, this other layer between everything that's really necessary and really important for helping people adopt and learn and get inspired to do things. I'd like to spend a little bit more time with your time with Morgan Stanley. I've got listed here that you worked on commodities, operations, renovation, Brexit-driven EU clearing migrations, global derivatives enablement. These are all just words to me.
Right.
Asset capability. that seems like a huge, broad set of skills and different things that you were understanding. How did you sort of navigate all of those leaps within that?
So this is sort of what I was referring to when I said deep investment banking sorts of things that don't mean anything to anyone outside the industry, right? If you work for an investment bank or a futures commission merchant, like those words will be meaningful to you. But in a nutshell, I'll say two things. One is when you work for a big company, and Morgan Stanley is very good about this, they give you the opportunity to move around internally. So I had like 12 different roles in 15 years there. And it doesn't really necessarily reveal itself on my resume, but I did many different things, worked for different businesses sort of within the bank, as we would say. And the other thing I would say is a lot of those things that you sort of rattled off there are projects. I primarily managed change projects, technology change projects to solve problems, whatever they might be. Some of them were responses to new laws and regulations. Some of them were unlocking business opportunities. Some were just operational automation, like building and renovating internal systems to make things more efficient. And essentially, I developed a reputation and made a career out of navigating within that very large organization to get stuff done and implement new systems and change within the organization. And I did that for many years. And it's sort of hard to explain to somebody who hasn't seen the inner machinations of an investment bank of 80,000 people. But essentially, when you've got a giant company like that, there's just an enormous amount of kind of knowing who to call, following process, getting approvals, and like connecting lots of dots because there's all this change happening at the same time. You're trying to like thread a needle to get stuff done in an environment. It's just like, it's kind of hard to convey like how many things are going on at one time.
No, I absolutely have a lot of respect for that because, as you said, just the simple kind of knowledge of how the animal is built from inside, and then being able to connect all of those things before you even thought about, all right, now what is the best practice for inspiring adoption or inspiring people to actually go along with this change? Because you can have the best process, the best tool in the world, but people need to use it and they need to be happy about using it.
Yeah.
Talk about, obviously, going from the investment bank to now working at Algorand Foundation in your DevRel position. Was there a moment, was there a mentor, was there a project or something that for you was the actual catalyst? And I'm just wondering if there was one thing that you look back on and you're like, gosh, I'm really glad I had that conversation, or I'm really glad I went through that project. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, that was the turning point for me.
I think when I worked on a wallet connection library with some other folks, that really took me down the rabbit hole. So for context, within the blockchain ecosystem, people have wallets that they use to manage their keys and so forth. And we have this code library. It's created and maintained by a community member. It's not like an official product of the foundation. And so this guy, Doug, had done incredible work to create this library that lots of people relied upon. And there were some things about it that I said, maybe those could be done differently. And I wanted to play with Solid.js, which is another reactivity library for front-end web development. And so I sort of made my own version of this library. But in partnering with him to talk about like the design approaches and the abstractions and the underlying dependencies and so forth, we ended up merging the two together. And we sort of took all the best things from his work and merged in some things that I had sort of pioneered in my approach to the library. And that was sort of an aha moment for me around open source and like working together on this free open source library and understanding how people use it and how it needs to be maintained over time. And it also gets you like really deep into the innards of the technology to do library development and have to handle all these edge cases. It's a different thing than developing an application where the code is not necessarily visible and you just sort of need it to work to achieve whatever the business outcome is. But libraries, you have to abstract everything and handle all these edge cases. And that I feel like was a leveling up moment for me, both in the Algorand ecosystem, but also just as a software developer.
Wonderful. I mean, it's always wonderful to be able to have those moments where you're like, that was a real skills curve moment, but
yeah.
Glad to have climbed it. Yeah. Is there anything that you think with regards to other DevRels or people getting into this space that you think there was sort of, as I know that you said that your ability to navigate change management, your ability to sort of interconnect the different spheres of different, a huge organization with different motivations from all the different places. What are the commonalities that you think other DevRels should maybe think about developing with regards to interpersonal skills or organizational skills outside of just sort of a technical skill set?
Well, that's a great question. One of the things that we talk a lot about when we strategize around enterprise adoption is understanding how to navigate organizations and identify who the decision makers are, and what sorts of things matter to a large organization that needs to make a buying decision or an adoption decision or a risk management decision. These are really important facets for adoption at scale in existing companies. And that's a very different challenge than inspiring a startup who doesn't have any technical debt. There's no like legacy code base and so forth. And so I try to map some of the experience that I have from within the big bank to what we do now to enable us to navigate those situations and know how to talk to people beyond just explaining how to get the code to work, right? Which is important. You've got to help the developer or whomever it is, troubleshoot that issue or get their integration working so they can have that sort of like aha moment about your tech. But actual adoption takes so much more effort than that. And we spend a lot of time partnering with our business development partners to have these like deep conversations about, how do we get this technology chosen and adopted and used over time, and not just like a side experiment that someone does as a proof of concept, but it doesn't really represent like an organizational decision to rely upon the technology. And that's what you want for the ongoing sustainability of any company selling technology, right? You want people to use that and to run their business on it and become part of the community that cares about it and sometimes even maintains it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you want those internal advocates who are like, this is what we're using, this is why we love it, and can kind of help do the education almost a little bit for you, I suppose.
Right.
You've been the person keeping the machinery running and also the one who's been inspiring and helping others to build something new. Do you ever miss the old side of your work?
Not a whole lot. However, I will say one of the things that's cool about working in a big organization is there's all sorts of things that have been like figured out. There's either resources for that, there's a process for that, there's a system for that, and you can rely upon those things many times to get things done. Outside of that context, you can't take any of those things for granted, and you have to act like you're small startup and sort of figure things out ad hoc and work in different ways. And whether that's like getting noticed and connecting with organizations or coming up with solutions to things. So I think like, it's interesting. We sometimes have debates within the foundation about like we're in an awkward space between being a super small startup where everybody knows what's going on and being a big company that has things kind of systematized and figured out. And so you have to blend those things together to be successful in sort of a small-ish company trying to do pretty ambitious things.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. As you say, enterprises are so set in their ways, and it's like, this is why we do it, and we actually have documentation on why we tried that previously. But I suppose
Right.
versus super scrappy, you're also like, well, we don't want to constantly be scrapping things along. We're a little bit bigger than that. So really interesting position to be in. And as you say, kind of live in that in between. Do you have moments where you think I could have chosen a much calmer life?
At the moment, I like to say that the DevRel role offers this great sort of bimodal distribution of calm at-home remote work and going out in the world to travel to conferences and events and being in the thick of it and having to wear your extrovert hat for a couple of days and talk to like 600 people at a conference, right? So each of those things is sort of a foil for the other. And I am thankful to have that opportunity because I don't think I would be happy if I was just sitting at home, working quietly and asynchronously all of the time. But I also wouldn't want to be on the road all of the time either. So it's a pretty unique opportunity to flex both of those muscles and blend them together, I think.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I often joke that I love routine until I get bored, and then I love variety until I feel overwhelmed.
Right.
So it's wonderful that you get both.
Yeah.
But yeah. So developer relationships. Obviously, it's sort of uniquely challenging. Developers are not a monolith of an audience at all. But I just from working in the way we work with them at Catchy, we've always got to be very conscious of which subset of developers we're speaking to, and their ever-present marketing radar for nonsense that they are just cut all the way through. How is it a little bit more challenging and perhaps a little bit more rewarding than just sort of traditional technical leadership?
That's like a really profound question, because inspiring developers is no small feat, right? So they often have very arcane like pain points and problems that they're trying to solve. They're like really deep in the weeds. And being able to get a developer who has this like really complex technical problem in their head to have that sort of glass shattering moment that your thing, your tool, your technology can address that for them, is a combination of understanding very deeply what it is they're trying to achieve and the tools that they're working with. And you have to have that sort of competence in the domain to speak their language. And I think you also have to be like incredibly authentic about everything, because developers will see through messages and marketing and fluff, and they have this like really keen eye for detail and meaning and so forth. And so we're always conscious of, are we being accurate, are we being authentic, and really putting forth technical products and all of the surrounding materials that will stand up against the sort of the how do I put this, like the discerning eye of the developer, right?
Yeah, the Occam's razor of their absolute critique. But
Yeah,
I mean, it's good. Don't get me wrong. It's wonderful to get that kind of feedback sometimes, where it's like, this is why it's not believable, or this is why I don't trust it. And I think that's a hard ask for anyone to ask them to trust something.
right.
I've listed 4 things here that I think encompass a really good global dev rel ecosystem: teaching, onboarding, empowering, and inspiring.
Mm.
Which of those to you would say is the hardest to do?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I would say inspiring, because it's kind of nebulous, right? And different developers will be inspired by different things. I would say there's a lot of existing sort of thought work about education and how to teach people things and onboarding. That's really just like a process and sort of a customer service domain sort of thing. And I have a lot of experience with both of those things, so they're like well defined in my head. But the inspiring part is really tricky, and sometimes it's about doing things that are only tangentially related to your core technology, but are that can be like an intellectual spark for a developer, right? And they're just interested in how that works, right? And you have them looking at something and they're like, whoa, right? That's pretty cool. Or I've always wanted to do something like that. And getting that spark of inspiration is, there's no handbook for that. And I think it's fair to say that developer relations as a profession is a relatively new profession compared to many others out there in the world. And I don't think there's a clear handbook for how to inspire people. So I think that's the most nebulous part of the job, right? Where you have to operate in a lot of ambiguity and just try to be interesting and get people like intellectually curious about what it is you're sharing with them, so that they'll go deep and then be intrinsically motivated to try your technology or even adopt your technology, because like they're having fun.
I think we're always so scared to say fun, but I mean, technology should be fun. There was always,
Yeah.
the point of pushing the whole barriers. Have you had a moment like that where you're like, okay, we've actually hit on something that I enjoy, and I'm sure others will?
Yeah, one of the guiding principles that we have is to let developers play, right? So when we've been working with our product and engineering teams to talk about all the tools and and then we think about how we present the tools and teach the tools and all this sort of thing, all these sorts of things, we have this North Star. It's like, let them play, right? Get them to the point where they understand how all the tools work. And then they're in the sandbox and they've got some idea. It doesn't matter if it's like a practical idea or whatever, but they've got some idea about how they might be able to use these tools. And then they can just sort of have a creative and divergent play experience with those tools. So you want to get people to the point where they know how to swing the hammer, they know how to turn the screwdriver, and now they're confident with these things, and they've got the spark of inspiration, and they can just go, right? So you want to like be as helpful as possible until they have that spark, and then get out of the way and let them play and sort of like feed their their exploration, and whatever they're doing that is fun and inspiring for them, right? Just be supportive and encouraging at that point, and make sure they're never unsure about how to use one of the tools, and they get stuck and discouraged.
That sounds the way you describe that makes it sound like woodworking class, where it's like, all right, now that you're safe and you're not going to put your hand through the circular saw, build a bird feeder. Yeah.
Exactly.
Tell me more about how Algorand Foundation approaches developer experience and community building, and what's exciting you about it currently.
So the developer experience is really, really important to us. I think it would be fair to say that across the blockchain industry, we probably have one of the best developer experiences out there. And I say that because we hear it from our developers that have built on other chains, and they come to us and they're like, this is actually really easy, right? It's like chewing glass to build things with some of these other chains, for reasons like you've got to learn special languages, or there's parts of the environment setup that are permissioned or are just a total pain to get set up, and it takes like days and so forth. So over the last few years at the foundation, there's been this long work stream around developer experience to sand off all the rough edges, understand what people need to do from their first touch all the way to getting an app into production. And we've created this whole kit, we call it Algo Kit, of tools, everything from command line tools to libraries and visual debuggers and things like this, VS Code plugins, so that along that whole journey, everything a developer would need to do, there's a tool for that, and it works well. So I think that clarity of vision around developer experience has been really transformational for us, and our ability to get developers like onboarded, as you mentioned earlier. And the testimonials tell the story, and people come back to us and they'll say, I tried to build something with your tech in like 2021. It was awful. And we're like, we know, we're so sorry. And like, this is amazing now. And some of the things we've built lately, like frameworks for Python and TypeScript, you can write smart contracts in real Python or real TypeScript without having to learn another language. Like, these are incredibly transformational for the developer experience and letting people like feel like the technology is approachable, which is big, right? There's an intimidation factor when people have to learn another language. So we've been trying to take all those intimidation factors, all of the developer sort of snags, right, and smooth them all off, and offer people this experience where, as soon as you understand how the tools work, you, as one of our engineers likes to say, you can just fall into the pit of success.
I love that analogy as well. It kind of, once you know your strokes, you can just start swimming and get in there. And that's one thing we have also noticed through a survey that we conducted recently. Your time to hello world, your time to just being able to try something,
Yes.
Needs to be minimized as much as possible, always trying to shave off those extra few seconds. I mean, obviously those testimonials are fantastic. I don't think you can get much better feedback than from the horse's mouth themselves. Is there another project that you've worked on recently that you're super proud of that you'd like to punt over here?
Well, I think the most remarkable one for me is Algorand TypeScript. Quite frankly, this is like, when I was first learning to build stuff on Algorand, this is the framework that I always wanted. I've really fallen in love with web development and TypeScript and all of the tooling around it. I think it's an incredibly like energetic area of software development, and part of that is because the tools are evolving really quickly. They're very high quality, so devs have super high expectations for the developer experience. But also because when you're in web development, you can see the results of what you're building immediately, right? With hot module replacement, you change something on your site, you can see it right then and there. So you have this fast feedback loop. So we wanted to tap into that ecosystem with Algorand TypeScript. And so you can build a whole app now, top to bottom, in TypeScript, front end, back end. And then with blockchain, there's this additional module of the chain and these on-chain applications we call smart contracts. So you have this like third module, a whole nother programming paradigm that you have to teach people. But if you can do it all in TypeScript and write in this like fluent way with the TypeScript you already know, the business logic that you need to run on chain, it just leads to these aha moments. And you can see, in many cases in startups, an individual developer bring this whole concept and a whole full stack app to fruition just with TypeScript. So this is the language framework I always wanted to have, going back to 2021. Now we just hit 1.0 a couple of weeks ago, and we're super happy about it. And it's just fun to build stuff. So that's my shameless plug.
No, I love it. I love it. And congratulations. That sounds great. And I think especially when it's like, that was my sort of arcane pain point, and now
Yep.
we've addressed it. Speaking of sort of making things easier for people, while I was spying on your profiles today, I found a YouTube short where you were talking about AI assisted coding, and I wanted to pick your brains on that and see, what your opinion is about vibe coding, and sort of what the learning curve looks like for future developers.
Oh, wow. This is a really deep question. I'm a bit of a skeptic of vibe coding for two reasons. One, I think LLMs in particular they're really good at producing something that looks right, but it often isn't right. And we're seeing a lot of stories now about the costs of untangling AI generated code and things like this. And then the other challenge here is when you think you can rely on an LLM to do things for you and just sort of like manifest code out of thin air, it tempts the user, it tempts the developer to skip the learning steps, right? And we're starting to see now anecdotes from university professors and people that are employing recent graduates that it seems like some people are skipping these steps of learning the fundamentals, learning the conceptual building blocks so that they know how to think and reason and solve problems. So my cautionary advice to developers would be on that front, right? Don't skip the fundamentals. AI is actually an incredible tutoring tool. Use it for that, right? Don't just use it to manifest code, right? And do things without you knowing what's going on. And then also, when you are using it to manifest code, be strict, right? Know what you want to achieve. Be verbose in how you prompt it, and give your LLM, or if you've got agents, give them strict guidelines on what they should be touching and not touching, and what success looks like, or the tests that need to pass, and so forth. And I think in the process of writing those prompts, you're actually organizing like requirements and success criteria and so forth in a way that's really central to the results of whatever project you're working on. So be skeptical of LLMs, right? Be strict, treat it like almost like an employee you don't quite trust to do things right. And I think it's an incredibly powerful tool in that context, but with a discerning eye, LLMs still fail to do even simple things correctly. And I was using it to do some styling of a website over the weekend, and I went through, and all the Tailwind classes, like 50% of them were useless, right? It's still just putting garbage out there.
I mean, I love the way you said, you still have to learn how to think in certain
Right.
ways, and you can't skip that. That is just the learning curve of understanding the logic behind the steps so that you know what good looks like. Otherwise, yeah, it can look fine. If you showed me a whole Python script, I'd be like, I guess it looks
Right.
like code. Same thing with, a novel. You'd be like, here's 1,000 pages. Like, well, that looks like writing. Where do you see developer relations evolving in the next 5 years, especially in blockchain?
Oh, wow. I would say the number one thing that everybody's talking about is how do we work with AI and enable people to have great outcomes in their workflows when AI is involved. And that can mean anything from working on traditional documentation, right? It used to be we would say RTFM, right? Read the manual. But now it's also LLMs reading the manual, and the extent to which you have docs and examples and lots of content about your technology, it enables those AI outcomes. But we're having a lot of conversations about how to meet developers where they are with these tools and offering them, in some cases, sort of a packaged AI assistant. In other cases, it's best practices. Like if you follow this approach, you'll be relatively successful building stuff with our technology. And you mentioned blockchain as part of that question. I think we have a really acute version of this problem because the technology is very frontier and it's evolving very quickly. So earlier this year, we launched the latest version of our AlgoKit toolkit in March. But all the frontier models from Anthropic and OpenAI had a training data set that went up to January. So we launched this toolkit, and the frontier models know nothing about it, right? So then we spend 6 months helping developers use frontier models with our new technology through things like Context 7 and very like hands-on prompting and so forth, so that they can use the new tech with a frontier model that knows nothing about it. And so I think being in this area sort of magnifies that AI assisted development challenge. And so we're constantly trying to stay ahead of that and listen to developers like, how are you actually working? Because we want to meet you where you are and not try to dictate how you should be building. So people are using Cursor and Windsurf and maybe Anti-Gravity now to do their development as opposed to just VS Code. And so you have to understand like rapidly changing work practices in this profession. So it's made everything very complicated. But when it works, the speed with which people can bring applications to production is incredible. So that's fun.
That is exciting. Yeah. I've got a couple more questions about DevRel. So sort of going back into just the overall concept of it, what's the biggest misconception amongst people who've worked with developer relations or who've worked with the developer ecosystem? Where do you find you often have to go, well, actually,
within the profession, people send memes around sometimes. They're like, what people think we do and what we actually do. And a lot of people think the DevRel is about just going to conferences and events and partying and stuff like this. And it's so funny. If there was a mathematical average member of my team and you ask them like, do you want to go to the after party after the conference, or do you want to like get dinner and then work on your side project quietly in your hotel room, right? They would choose the latter, right? So there's a bit of a reputation that it's all like, being out there and away from the computer and away from the office and doing the networking and partying and all this sorts of stuff. And there's like a little bit of that, but it's a tiny, tiny fraction of what we do. And most of the time, people are highest energy when we're inspired by some cool new use case that we could prove or use in a workshop or something like that, and you can just see the light on people's faces. So sometimes we have to overcome this misconception that all we do is go out and do the conference circuit and go to these events and stuff like that. But the vast majority of the hard work is in between those things, when you're brainstorming and experimenting and debating, fiercely debating internally, like what's the best way to teach this arcane technology. That's where DevRel really happens on a day-to-day basis, at least in my team.
And I imagine like interconnecting all of those different threads, like things that you've heard from events and things that you've heard on Discord, and knowing what's coming from your own perspective and actually understanding like, all right, try to combine this all into one single sort of thrust. That must be just keeps you up at night, I imagine.
Always thinking about it. Always thinking about it. And we try to dog food our technology as much as possible so that we can integrate things that way. I don't want to speak too broadly, but sometimes I think for Algorand and for a blockchain, we have it particularly hard because the technology that we have to teach and evangelize and inspire people to use spans the whole stack and then some. Whereas if you worked for a database company or a UI framework or something like that, you're really operating at like one layer of the stack. But we have the whole thing from front end components down to the server, plus the blockchain nodes and all kinds of sort of glue technologies that keep it all together in a complete application. So we have to span this really wide range. And that's tough sometimes.
I don't doubt, yeah. But it sounds like you're doing wonderful work, and as you said, kind of addressing those true pain points and just staying au fait to what is actually happening in the world, and being open to those the feedback from actual developers. If you had to look back at yourself before you went into DevRel, what would be the advice you would give young Brian?
Wow, that's a really good question. I feel like I did a good bit of this already, but I probably would tell my former self, like, spend even more time learning and experimenting all the time, and just expanding your skills. Because one of the things that's amazing about working in the world of software is there's constant skill development and maintenance, and trying different languages and frameworks and tools and databases and so forth gives you perspective. It gives you like the vocabulary to communicate with people, and also like shared experience, so that you can like share those like knowing looks with people when somebody makes a comment about some technology that everyone's been frustrated with, right? And so, I took this self-guided path of learning like web development, and before that I was doing stuff like embedded with microcontrollers, Raspberry Pis, and so forth. But I think going even wider and just trying things out and constantly experimenting in a maybe a more intentional way is probably the advice I would give my former self. And I also would say to my current self, right, to try to make time for that. Right? It's easy to always be responding to stakeholder demands and the next thing you've got to get out. But that ongoing skill development is actually like really crucial to be on top of your game as a DevRel. And so I'm always inspired by learning. I consider myself a lifelong learner. And if I had known I was going into this profession, I would have been more intentional about that 5 years ago, I think.
Well, I mean, we're not dead yet. So, as you said, being a lifelong learner, and we have so much access to so many resources and so many wonderful people and mentors, and definitely to keep up with it and continue to drive Algorand Foundation the right way. I have one last question, and it's just because we are shooting this in the week of Thanksgiving. I read on your Algorand little bio there that you're always cooking something up, whether it's in code or in the kitchen. So tell me what your potluck go-to dish would be to bring to Thanksgiving and why developers specifically would love it.
Oh, that's a really fascinating question. So I like to cook all different kinds of things, but the most recent thing that I cooked and took to a potluck, which was Friendsgiving on Saturday night just passed, was green beans almondine. And it was a recipe from Serious Eats that is a bit more elaborate than it needs to be, but it's one of these things where when you take the time to like, brown the butter and toast the nuts and like impart the flavor of the garlic and the shallots to the sauce and so forth, it like transforms it into a green bean dish, right? And the green vegetable dish is never like the highlight of a potluck, but this was incredible and it was the most flavorful one I've ever made. And I think, to tie it back to software and being a developer, I think people can appreciate when there's a lot of behind the scenes work that goes into making an incredible experience. And cooking is sort of the same way, right? You don't necessarily see at a glance that a casserole dish full of green beans is going to be incredible. But when you taste it and you like put it in your mouth and you taste that incredibly rich sauce, you're like, whoa, some like real work went into this to achieve that magic. And I think there's some parallels to the software where there's like all kinds of work that goes on behind the scenes to create these experiences for people. And on both fronts, that's really motivating to me.
I absolutely love that answer. Well, Brian, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate everything you've shared with us today. This has been very fun for me. Is there anything else you'd like anyone to keep in mind about Algorand? Anything you've got coming up that you'd like to share that we keep an eye out for?
Oh my gosh. Well, if you haven't looked at Algorand and wanted to have a play around, reach out to me, pop into our Discord. We are very self-aware at the foundation that blockchain is not a solution to all problems, but it is a good solution for certain types of problems. And the tech has come a long way. So many times at conferences, I say to people, whatever impressions that you had that it was a regulatory gray area or it's all about scams or whatever from years ago, or maybe the tech wasn't there and it didn't actually work. Basically, none of that is true anymore. The tech has caught up. Some really cool stuff that's already been built and is running in production on chain. And I'd love to tell you about it and inspire you to have a play around with the tech. But it's really come a long way. It's more accessible. It's more performant, and it is having real world impact in some of the ways you touched on earlier, like really changing people's lives when it comes to access to financial services and things like that around the world. So hop on in and have a play around and reach out to me.
That was such a lovely invitation. I might try, and I will definitely break something along the way, but I really appreciate it.